Hello and welcome to episode 117 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. And I should say, welcome back to this short series of 4 podcast episodes that I'm making in collaboration with the Food Farming and Countryside Commission. And the series is all about linking different voices in food and farming. Today, we're talking about diet and dietary change. For quite a long time now, it's been accepted that some form of change is required in Western diets, at least, if we're going to tackle the climate, nature, and health challenges that the world faces. However, and this is really one of the questions that I and the FFC wanted to tackle was how do we change? Further, do those who work in food and farming have a responsibility to lead the way and change what is produced? And finally, what can we all do as consumers to shift our own diets? Well, to discuss all this and more, I'm joined by a panel representing all sides of this debate. Tom Hunt is a chef, food writer, and sustainability consultant, and the author of Eating for Pleasure, People and Planet. His Bristol restaurant, Poco, has won numerous awards, including Best Ethical Restaurant at the Observer Food Monthly Awards. Barbara Bray MBE is a registered nutritionist and food safety consultant, as well as co-chair of the Oxford Farming Conference and also a former guest of this podcast. And last but not least, also a seasoned guest of the show, George Young is an Essex farmer who has recently transformed his farm with a long-term plan for utilising agroecological techniques of farming. Welcome to you all. Honestly, thank you so much for this. I've been particularly looking forward to doing this one. Listeners will almost certainly know the issues behind today's podcast. So when I was planning this with the FFCC, we decided that we'd focus this episode on the what next, I suppose, rather than the why. However, I want to give you all a few minutes, first of all, to set out your vision for dietary change in terms of what you think we should be working to achieve. And then we'll go on to discuss how we do that. Barbara, can we start with you?
Thank you very much, Ben. And what a big topic to start with, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So people are well aware of a lot of the issues that we already have, but I think when setting out the vision of what we want to work to achieve, as a nutritionist, we always talk about having a balanced diet, but I think we have maybe been a bit too narrow in our field of thinking. We need to look at how that balanced diet sits from a societal point of view. So for me, it's about making sure that everyone has enough to eat. I think sometimes we put too much focus on the fact that people are carrying more weight than they should and have too much to eat. But we need to remember that there are a lot of people who don't have food security and their choice is actually quite limited. And that's probably why, and that's one of the causes, I guess, why they're not able to make the best dietary choices because they don't have funds. And on the other end of the scale, we still have malnutrition in people who can afford to eat whatever they want because the choices that they're making and the food that's available to them isn't giving them the balance of nutrients that they need in their diet. So there are quite a few things that we need to change. So when you look at some of the advice that we give about eating more fibre, eating more fresh fruit and vegetables, or fruit and vegetables in general, whatever shape or form they come in, that still holds. But I do think we need to widen our gaze as nutritionists and think about the societal issues and touch on things that people necessarily don't want to talk about. So alcohol consumption. Chatting to a friend recently who said him and his wife made the decision that lockdown is not the time for cheap wine. So whilst that's quite amusing, I think there are people out there who may have overindulged in the quantity of alcohol that they take. And is alcohol an essential thing that we need? No, it's not. It's about pleasure. But again, growing crops to produce beer, for example, is that taking away from producing other crops that would be more nutritious? And then what we're growing for confectionery as well, is our confectionery consumption too high for our average diet? So those are some things we need to look at. It's not about banning anything. It's just about having the right foods in moderation.
Tom, you've clearly written about this at length. Do you want to set out your piece?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here chatting with you all. I'm really excited about it, actually. So, yeah, over the last 10 years, I've been creating a vision and manifesto called Route to Fruit Eating, which I've laid out in my latest book that you mentioned, Eating for Pleasure, People and Planet. And so really the kind of point of my manifesto naturally is to help create change through empowerment, not just for people cooking at home, but also for businesses as well, because the impact we have as a business or corporation is obviously kind of massively increased. So root for eating means eating for pleasure, eating whole foods from the whole farm, whilst eating the best food we can. As Barbara was saying, when it comes down to it, we need to be able to have affordable diets. But it also means indulging in seasonal foods that are tasty, nutritious, and inherently restorative for ourselves and the planet. So Root for Eating is a 12-point manifesto. It's got 3 key points: eat for pleasure, eat whole foods, and eat the best food you can. They all drop down into kind of further detail with points such as support biodiversity, better farming, cook with love, confidence, and creativity. But really, my driving force for creating this sustainability philosophy is a deep belief in equality and utter disbelief in the injustice our food system brings to so many people. So my main vision really is, and the kind of whole reason for my being, is to help create a fair and equitable global food system that makes good food accessible and affordable for all, whilst acknowledging our connection to all life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive subject in itself. I mean, George, you've been ushering in a lot of change in terms of what how you're growing on your farm in Essex. But what about your vision for dietary change more generally?
I mean, I'll start by saying I am obviously just a farmer.
That's what you always say, George.
So my level of expertise with actual dietary change itself, and obviously the health ramifications are obviously a lot more similar than Barbara and Tom. But I mean, quite simply, I think there are some really basic ones. One is I really want to see a move towards localistic food, and obviously that localistic food being available, and essentially having a system whereby we are able to consume less calories because those calories are more nutrient dense, and kind of moving to a diet with significantly less meat, but obviously that meat being of much higher quality. I would like to see people actually cooking from home, because that's when they really start understanding, if they're making food from the actual base ingredients, rather than obviously just buying in something pre-made, even if it's the healthier ready meals which are now available. I still don't think it's as good as people cooking from scratch and really understanding what they're putting in their bodies. So a much more simplistic answer than the other two, but I think that would be a really good start.
Well, actually, and linked in actually to what you just said, George, and actually I think it's an important point to mention early on. Clearly, the last 12 months, we've seen massive change in terms of the way we live, the way we work, and also the way we cook and eat food as well. I mean, Tom, what's your view been on the last 12 months in terms of, do you think that it will actually usher in some sort of transformational change? What are we going to continue to see, and how might the way we eat change?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some really inspiring stats actually that describe how our food waste has dropped dramatically during the pandemic, and how also a lot of people have started cooking more. I haven't got them to hand, but they're impressive. Like George was saying, actually just starting to cook is a great step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So my hope would be certainly that we've learned something from this experience, and that we'll be able to take this forward. And also an ability to connect better with our farmers procuring this food through supporting VegBot schemes and stuff like that. I know that most of our shopping, or a great percentage of our shopping, went online at the beginning of the pandemic, and the supermarkets at that point just couldn't cope, and you couldn't book in a slot to get a delivery. And I think that, as well as people looking to buying from VegBox schemes more anyway, that inability from the supermarkets to support our food system pushed a lot of that custom towards VegBox schemes and buying direct from farmers, which I think has managed to maintain its popularity, which is also incredibly inspiring.
I mean, Barbara, do you think that there'll be, in terms of diet and dietary change, I suppose let's stick with that, do you think there'll be any impact from the pandemic?
There will be an impact from the pandemic. When you look at, like Tom was saying, some of the statistics, I think what initially happened first lockdown, food waste dropped because people had restrictions on where they could shop and where they could get out of home food from. So people were having to plan a lot better. Now, obviously, we're starting to see the out of home sector move in, and there is a worry that the food waste will start to creep back up as people go back to some of their old habits. I think, there were more or less a couple of camps of people, those who decided to go healthy for lockdown and those who were kind of, I need to be comforted sitting on the couch watching Netflix, and one or two people flitted in between. But I think when you start to build up a habit over a long period of time, there's hope that you can maintain that. But the problem is that the environment around us is going to be changing quite rapidly. So before we had quite a restricted environment. If you fancied going and eating something, for example, the street where I live, if I just fancied a hot lunch out that I hadn't made myself, there was no hot lunch. I had to make it myself.
Yeah.
Whereas now I can walk 15 minutes down the road and pick something up from the cafes on the high street. So those choices are now there, whereas they weren't before. So yes, it was great. I was really disciplined during lockdown, but actually, was I disciplined, or was it just that I only had a certain environment to pull food from? And now that that's changing, I think with a lot of other people will be tempted to change those habits or just say, well, it's just this once. And that's when the changes in habits come in. And I do think it's important to remember that environment is a huge part of food choice. So if you're flicking through Instagram, for example, and you're seeing all these lovely recipes that chefs do and Instagram influencers do, it does make you think, oh, I feel a bit hungry and tempted by that. And it all helps shape how we have a relationship with food and what we decide to consume. So I think it's important to tell people that it's not about your own personal thoughts. You're having a constant influence on what you're seeing and doing and your behavior from outside. So it's not about willpower. It's just about making sure that you're not immersed in this consumption and this high consuming environment all the time, because it just doesn't help have a healthy lifestyle all the time.
Interesting. George, from a farming perspective, let's focus in on growing. Do you think that farmers have a responsibility to shift what they're growing? And how would you convince a farmer who has always grown certain crops to pivot what they do?
So obviously, as farmers, we're in a really funny time at the moment. The basic payment scheme, the subsidy scheme is being phased out. And obviously, farmers have been incentivized for the past sort of 50 years to go down a certain form of production. That's 2 or 3 generations who have been farming in that way. So it's obviously a massive, massive shift. Now, something obviously you and I, Ben, have talked about is the question which I love posing myself, which is what can our farms be? What can they do? Which is obviously not just even on a food production basis, but on a greater kind of community scale as well. I actually think that, phrasing it as a responsibility of farmers to do something is interesting, because I actually think that with BPS going, it will be a necessity for farmers to be beginning to make those changes to ensure that they actually remain in a profitable situation or remain in business. We've essentially had that BPS payment covering off years when things don't do so well, and then being obviously more of a bounce when things do well. If we haven't got that, you need diversified production on the farm to balance and to ensure that you have a cash flow that doesn't kind of go in peaks and troughs all the time, year on year, but one that is actually kind of stable. But I would kind of say that from my perspective, as someone who has diversified considerably from sort of 3 crops originally to now growing many more arable crops, bringing in livestock, obviously planting a lot of fruit and nut trees, and starting work on trying to get a market garden on the farm as well. It's a lot of work, but it's so much fun for a farmer.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are some farmers who won't find it fun. If you're a little bit nutty like me, I think it's terrific fun to start seeing what your farm is actually able to produce. And then, this is what is then going to enable that localistic production. But I really think in terms of like, how are we actually going to get farmers to make this pivot, to make that change onto doing diversified stuff? My view is actually pretty stark here, which is that I think if you carry on, say, arable farming, for instance, if you carry on trying to grow, in fact, actually now it's not even 3 crops, is it? Now we've lost the ecological side of BPS. We can grow 1 if we want to.
EFA's gone, yeah.
I think if farmers, choose to go down that route of growing minimal crops, it's all very well for the short term, but they're going to start really, really struggling. And I actually think this is a brilliant opportunity, because harsh as it might sound, but if some of those farmers start going out of business, need to start thinking about shifting land to keep the bills, paid, maybe we've got a great opportunity here for new entrants to come into the industry. We've actually got this opportunity where farmers might be forced to either change or accept that they've got to get new people coming in. And that's when we get vibrancy in the industry. And there's a huge number of new entrant farmers, or wannabe new entrant farmers, who I meet, who are desperate to do these really diversified forms of production. And of course, the brilliant thing is, we don't need 500 acres, 1,000 acres, 10,000 acres to grow stuff on. A farmer can be a fantastic farmer on, 5 acres, even less than 5 acres, and grow a really diversified set of foodstuffs, which are then going to start satisfying this localistic demand, and then satisfying a much more kind of balanced diet as well. So that's kind of where I think it's probably going to go. I would rather farmers pivot rather than getting forced out of business. That's probably the kind of way of putting it. But I think ultimately change will happen whether they want it or not.
Okay. I mean, Tom, do you want to come in on that? I want to focus on that idea of responsibility, really. It can't just be up to the bottom end of the food chain to do this. It has to be a shared process here. So what about across the supply chain? Where does this responsibility for change lie?
I think it has to lie at every single point of the food chain, but ultimately be supported and driven by government and larger corporations who should proper support their farmers, rather than, well, at the moment, the current model really is more about exploitation and also not supporting local farming and food production more, from what I understand, especially kind of after and through the Brexit process. The government is looking to rely again more on food imports, which just doesn't make any sense. I'm with George and think localizing our food systems is the only sustainable option and only economically viable option, rather than just supporting farms for public money for public goods. And paying farmers to rewild land is great in some respects, but actually producing food and regenerating the land at the same time obviously has kind of a multiple of benefits. But I also just wanted to kind of touch back on what George was saying about the economic viability of agrodiversity. And for me, I don't hear that much from farmers, and I think that's really inspiring and so important, because you can think about it on so many levels, how homogeneity versus biodiversity just doesn't make sense. There's resilience in diversifying not just our crops but everything, even our kind of cultural diversity. So it's just really, really inspiring to hear that, and something I support wholeheartedly.
And then turning towards all of us, I suppose, as consumers who eat food, how would you inspire people to alter their diet and perhaps try new things?
The more we learn about our food system, the more we understand it's broken. And I think that understanding isn't just coming now from people like us who are totally neck deep in this. It's like the whole of the global population realizes there's a problem. So once we start to think about these things, and I've spent a lot of time specifically thinking about food waste, but I know that a lot of other people from kind of a multitude of different disciplines have come to the same conclusion, that really we're in this kind of situation because we've lost touch with food's true value and ultimately nature. What we need to do is kind of work to mend those connections, and we can do that really simply just by eating consciously. I mean, again, as kind of George and Barbara were saying earlier, if we can cook more, we're taking a great step in the right direction. And it's really easy to do that. And I mean, luckily, as a chef and food writer, recipe writer, I'm in a position to help people do that. And I think the best way for us to do that really is to help inspire people to cook not just with recipes, but without recipes, and to really, as I say in my manifesto, cook with love, confidence, and creativity, and to kind of use up those odds and ends and be really kind of practical and enjoy the food they're eating through that connection that I'm talking about. Because the more we can reconnect with that food, the more we understand its true value. It's not just kind of a £1 loaf of bread that we can kind of let go moldy. It's something that we're invested in.
Let's turn towards the health side. Barbara, I mean, what impact might a changing diet, and it depends how everyone changes their diet, of course, have on our overall health as individuals, but also as a society in general? This is more about the why here, I suppose.
It is about the why. When you look at the whole chain, so if you think about the system that incorporates production at farm level, if there are problems there and people are dropping out or having to change, and we have a reduced amount of meat, for example, if that then forces, so say for example you have, I don't know, a reduced amount of red meat, so fewer beef cattle, and then people start having more poultry, what effect will that have on the environment? Because if you look at all the new programs that have been into place around sustainable, environmentally safe way of farming, then, you know, where does poultry fit? If we're going to increase our poultry consumption, yes, that might have a better impact on our health, depending on how we do that. But is there going to be a negative impact on the environment if poultry farms don't really have anything to do with the ELM scheme? I think we need to look wider than just, let's just switch from red meat and let's just switch from this and switch from that. I think we need to look at the whole diet and the impact it has on the environment, but also as individuals. Not one diet is good for the whole population. And yes, as Public Health England, we have a dietary recommendation that's at population level, but we need to be careful around how we interpret that, because the diet that's ideal for a teenage boy is not the ideal diet for a grandmother, for example. We need to take different amounts of food. And I just feel that over the years, because we've had this one size fits all approach, as people age, they've taken some of the things that they've learned in their younger years. For example, you know, I look at my mother's generation, they were all told to eat low fat diets and so on. And when they get to their older years, actually, it's good to have a healthy amount of fat, but when you spend a lifetime of doing something, it's very hard to get people of that age group to change. They're being told to eat less all the time, but at that age, going on a calorie restricted diet is not a good idea. But unfortunately, those sorts of messages aren't getting out because we've just got this one size fits all population diet. Yeah. I do feel that we need to be very careful about how we get those messages out, so people change their diets in a way that's right for them, and not just, well, I've just made this change and that's got X consequence and everything's fine. Life's not that simple.
Let's broaden all this out and think of the how change is actually going to happen. Do you think that this is going to be driven by all of us as individuals, by market demand, by government intervention, or by those working in food driving change? George?
So I think, I mean, ultimately, I guess it's probably a mix of everything.
Yeah.
For me, I think the most meaningful change comes if it does come from the ground up and is actually, you know, driven by farmers and driven by consumers. But I suppose the worry would be the time it will take for something like that to actually kind of occur. So from a personal kind of motivation and personally what I'm trying to achieve on my farm, I'm trying to produce a model here which could be rolled out, you know, across other farms, so they could, you know, see what I'm doing, understand it, see the kind of demand that I'm hoping to create. I'm taking a kind of, you know, build it and they'll come Kevin Costner approach that I'm assuming there's a market here when I start producing all these things. And if I'm wrong, yeah, that won't be great.
Innovation is hard.
But I think one of the really important things is, and I mean, Tom mentioned the value of food earlier, and it's this point that, you know, food is so undervalued at the moment, and from a farming perspective, food is then really underpriced. What we're selling our crops for, they're, you know, underpriced for us. One of the big things that gets kicked back is, you know, people talking about food poverty, and food poverty is obviously a massive thing, and it almost feels like, by, you know, when these subsidies first came in, it felt like it was government saying, right, if we do this, food gets cheaper and we no longer have to worry about food poverty. It's the farmer's job. Well, actually, food poverty is caused by poverty in general, and it's nothing to do with the farmer. So, you know, where governments need to sort out poverty, sort out the inequality we have in our, in society, such that the fact that, food is going to end up being more expensive when it's more local, when it's more diverse. But as long as we haven't got people who are on that poverty spectrum, they will still be able to afford that food that's very, very valuable to them health-wise, and all the benefits.
Tom, do you want to come in there and perhaps suggest also whose responsibility is it to drive change?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear George talk about how the government have just been like, okay, that's the farmer's problem. They've got to make food cheaper. And
yep.
I agree, this is a food poverty issue. And it's a shame that when, we say, well, actually food's too cheap, you get kind of demonized in the sense that it's maybe seen as undemocratic, but of course it's not true. It's actually a democratic vision for kind of supporting the farmers and everyone in being able to eat well. Of course, this change is happening now. It's already happening. I mean, it's happening on every single level as well. I mean, the UN and their global goals, which we're now kind of in the decade of delivery before, meeting them, if we manage to farmers and consumers who are all becoming fully aware of the issues and how important their own impact is. It's all happening. Unfortunately, it's not all good, is it? I mean, there's a lot of troubling things happening, especially through Brexit, which I don't want to keep mentioning.
There's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I mean, really, to be honest, to catalyze the change that we're seeing, we need to really hold our governments and corporations accountable, and really understand that we do have a voice as individuals when we choose to use it, and when we contact our MPs and governments, they're kind of recording that, and it's affecting their decisions. And so I think it's something we don't do enough as individuals, and I know it has an impact. I mean, this is on a much smaller level, but I heard once about this huge seafood restaurant chain who improved their sourcing policy of their fish after just receiving 10 written inquiries about their fish sustainability. And that, it doesn't take so much all the time. It can just be, a few people kind of coming together and really just putting their foot down and complaining, because that's how we're going to affect this change much quicker than we're seeing already.
Barbara, how's the change going to happen?
I was just nodding at what Tom was saying, because yes, it's really important that we recognise that change can come from all sides. And there's a great quote that says the food system isn't broken, it was actually made this way. And I think we need to unmake it and make it better, because it's only serving some people, and the change needs to come from all around the food system. It's not just one part. It's not saying to farmers, grow healthier crops. It's about what we're doing at a manufacturing level, what we're doing at the out-of-home sector, and how we're doing our private and public procurement. So like Tom was saying, a company can have a vision and a mission that's not aligned with its consumers, but when they get that information, they can then realign and make sure they're doing the right thing. And I think the same could be said for public procurement. The government can make better decisions about the food that goes into hospitals, schools, prisons, and so on. So there are so many touch points that need to be tweaked, and some that need to be completely rewritten. It's not one thing, and in particular, it's not just down to the consumer. Consumers don't make a choice. They take from what's available, and we need to shift what's available and make sure that that's tasty and affordable, so that everyone can enjoy their food and at a level that, it's at their price point.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised public procurement, because we're discussing that in the next episode. Let's think about support, I suppose, and what support is required and from who to drive the change. We have talked about government on a broad basis, but let's perhaps think about specific bits of support, and let's all pretend to be policy advisors just for the time being. Barbara, I'm just going to bounce this straight back to you.
Oh, policy is so interesting. There was a report published by Kelly Parsons at City University last year that said there are 16 government departments in England that feed into food policy. And is there any wonder why we are struggling? Because if those departments don't talk to each other, then they've all got key performance indicators that are not aligned. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we have a one-size-fits-all problem. It's more about the fact that we have lots of different things we need to deliver on food, and everybody isn't talking in the same language or having the same objectives. And if we could bring all those departments to work in an aligned way, that would solve quite a few of the problems, because you won't have a treasury saying, well, you've got X amount of cash, but a school system saying, well, we can't feed the kids for X amount of cash. So you need to line everything up properly and make sure that what we're asking people to do is actually going to have the outcome that we anticipate, and it's not going to cut our nose to spite our face. So that would be my wish, is to bring all the different policymakers together in an aligned way that they have to deliver on the same outcomes.
Yeah. Who is it, Tom, that actually requires the support, do you think, and who should be supporting them?
Again, it's kind of each level of the food chain needs support. Farmers need support, and then people purchasing food who are in poverty need support. It's not just governments who need to support the farmers or the people who are purchasing their food. It's the people that need to support better farming, and restaurants as well, who, as a restaurant owner, I'm fully aware that we can support our farmers. And actually, when you're talking about small market gardens, each individual consumer that purchases from them is a huge support, because they might only be, they might have a box scheme. I think the magic number that I seem to see for many box schemes is 150 subscribers. And that seems to be a model that works. And of course, each and every one of those subscribers to that box is supporting that farm. And the same goes for a restaurant. So I think it's good to know that even as individuals, we can support farmers in a better food system.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, George, you started this discussion today by illustrating very effectively, I thought, that transformation in direct farmer support as BPS is withdrawn, basic payment scheme, for anyone listening who doesn't know that. And we are seeing we will be seeing a complete transformation in farm support over the next few years. So I'll bounce that question to you. So what support is required, and from who, to drive the changes that we've been talking about today?
I mean, I would actually really echo exactly what Tom was just saying, that I think that at the moment, the public don't realize the power for change in food that they have. And so for me, it's the sort of thing that if the public really start engaging with how their food is produced and start interacting with farmers and asking those questions, the consumer can actually choose what they eat, which can actually properly have an effect on biodiversity loss and climate change. And I don't think consumers realize that at the moment. They kind of think that any meat is any meat. They don't realize that meat can be raised in different ways. They don't realize that grains can be raised in different ways. They don't understand that. And there's a funny thing, because I suppose something could be leveled against me talking like that is, well, why should a consumer have to know about food? Why is it relevant for them to know about food?
The age-old comment that always goes back to the farmer.
Yeah, but then I kind of think, well, you should know about it because it's something you put in your body 3 times a day. Like it is everybody's job to know about that. And so much comes down to education, and it would help if education started at, with children, but with the society we have today, where we haven't had particularly good food education anyway, and people haven't been made to be inquisitive about their food, we need to stimulate that inquisition in the older generations as well, to be fascinated as to how their food is grown, and to realize the importance of the way that food is grown. So yeah, for me, it's public are the ones who I think can make the really big shift if they start understanding the power that they have.
And finally, let's bring this back to the individual. If someone listening is planning their weekly shop at the moment, what should they be thinking about in terms of potentially changing their own shopping habits? Barbara, have you done your weekly shop? Yeah, I'm really intrigued to see what's in your weekly shop.
Oh,
we should all be taking lessons.
A nutritionist's worst question, because we're ordinary people like everybody else, so we'll all have something of everything in our weekly shop. But the thing that I really learned during lockdown is to plan my weekly shop better. I was a little bit seat of the pants, plan it for kind of 5 days and freewheel for a couple, but now I literally do it for the whole entire week. So I have got lots better at that. So I have vegetables delivered. I have most of my shopping delivered. but I'm really focusing on making sure that I eat foods that are going to give me that level of fibre and give me my 5 a day, and not just 5 a day, look at the range. So diversity is the important thing when you're buying food, and it's too easy to fall into the habit of buying the same thing week in, week out, and seasons change and your food should change as well. It's not good to just have the same thing over and over again. I know there are certain groups of people who have to eat like that because of restrictions, but for everybody else, do look at how you can make your food more interesting and colourful and enjoyable, still within your budget, but making sure that you have a good eating experience that's giving you the nutrients that you need. So I'm not saying we should ban all the alcohol and chocolate and bits and pieces, but take it easy and take it steady, things in moderation. So that's my advice. Look at the labels and make sure, like George is saying, you're not just randomly selecting things because they tick a box. There might be some extra information that shows you about how that product has been produced that will help the environment as well, not just your weekly shopping bill.
Tom, any advice from you?
Yeah, so I mean, save money and improve your diet by bolstering your basket with whole grains, pulses, and plants. Invest in your future by supporting better farming. Buy direct through a community supported agricultural scheme, CSA or veg box, or farmers markets, and you'll improve your health through nutrient dense foods, but also through connecting with your local and global food communities, as I was saying earlier. But as Barbara was saying, diversity, color, and fiber. I mean, what a brilliant trio.
And let's finish with the farmer, George.
Those are two excellent responses to this question. My little point, I mean, absolutely. I mean, so we're in actually a fantastic time though, because of the pandemic. A load of farmers had to pivot what they were doing just over a year ago because their markets, which were into restaurants, a lot of markets like that, they dried up, and these farmers had to pivot and start supplying people, individuals, which means there is a massive range of choice of meat boxes, of veg boxes.
Yep.
Like, don't go to the supermarket to plan your weekly shop, but go online, see what's in your local area. There will be, as Tom said, there'll be a local CSA veg box. There will be some fantastic meat suppliers where you can actually see, they'll have a website, you'll see how their animals are raised. That would be my advice. Go and actually, start educating yourself on how amazing some of this produce can be. And obviously then you can see the person you're supporting. So that would be my advice there.
Perfect. Well, sadly, that is all we have time for. But a huge thank you to my guests today, Tom Hunt, Barbara Bray, and George Young. Next time, we'll be looking at the issue of public procurement and shorter supply chains, and I'll be joined in discussion with Simon Wright and Rosie Jack. So I hope you can join me then. But until then, have a great week.